that just cuts it off. It's really soft.
And you do have gain on yours?
Good morning. Could I ask everybody to take their seats, please? Gee, gosh, you all are really obedient. Thank you. I appreciate that. Good morning. I'm Terry Freeman, president of the National Civil Rights Museum, and I am thrilled to have you here with us this morning for the second day of our symposium during the 50th anniversary commemoration. It is truly my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to this day 2 of our symposium. I hope some of you were able to go to the first day, and I just want to say it was fabulous. So if you were there, can I get a hand clap for first day? It was great. So our theme for this entire commemoration is, where do we go from here? I've stated this often over the past year. This theme was compelling, not only because it was Dr. King's title for his final book, but because it really makes us think about the future and what's next. Today, we will delve into several of the issues that Dr. King himself felt required to have almost a laser-like attention on, not just by the powers that be, but by the power that is us. Why was Dr. King in Memphis in April of 1968? Because of the nexus of two issues, labor and poverty. Two issues that, frankly, should not be stated in the same sentence, frankly. If you provide a service through your labor, you should not find yourself living a life of poverty. Today, we will take up both of those issues, and we'll also examine the promise of education, asking if that promise has been kept or broken over the 64 years since Brown versus the Board of Education. It is said that education is the great equalizer, but that's only true if the quality of the education is equal. We will not solve these pressing and urgent issues in a 7-hour day, obviously, but we expect to walk away with recommendations for steps that we can take to move an agenda forward. We do hope that each of you come away with the inspiration, focus, and renewed drive to pursue these issues to a desired conclusion, one that is beneficial to all people and one the same topics in 10 years. We are not a solo act here today in hosting this symposium. We have had the pleasure, and I do say pleasure, to work with the University of Memphis, Cecil C. Humphrey School of Law. And I'd like to ask Dean Peter Letsu to come and give you a welcome.
Good morning, everybody. On behalf of the University of Memphis and its faculty, staff, and students, it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you to the second day of our 2-day symposium, which reflects on the lasting impact of Dr. King and his work. And it follows a wonderful first day, and I know today is going to be even better. Today's symposium comes at the culmination of a year-long commemoration of Dr. King's tragic assassination in Memphis 50 years ago. And at this symposium, we'll continue this year-long remembrance, but we'll also look forward to focus on the critical question Dr. King left for us with his passing. And that's the title of this symposium: where do we go from here? How do we address the ongoing challenges affecting freedom, equality, and justice in Memphis, across our nation, and around the globe? The University of Memphis occupies a unique position in our community. With more than 21,000 students and thousands of faculty and staff, we're a focal point for research, for teaching, and for learning. We're also deeply engaged with and committed to Memphis and Shelby County and to our state and our nation. The combination of expertise on the one hand and community engagement on the other gives our university the special capacity and the special responsibility to serve as a facilitator of critical conversations around the core issues that impact all of us as citizens. Through today's program, we will address and continue to examine the critical issues related to civil rights and human rights and racial and economic equity 50 years after Dr. King's death. These are, of course, issues of enormous complexity, which have been with us for a very, very long time, from the founding of our nation and before. And as Terry Freeman already said, we won't be able to promise solutions to these problems over the course of this symposium, but we can promise to move these critical conversations forward, and we can also promise a tremendous learning experience for everybody who joins with us. I'd like to join with President Freeman in thanking our moderator and our panelists, our sponsors, and the incredible members of the University of Memphis and the museum staff who've made these events over the last 2 days possible and done such a remarkable job. Programs like this just don't happen. They're the result of a community of efforts, and we're especially fortunate at the University of Memphis and at the museum to be part of such a remarkably supportive community. I'd also like to thank Terry Freeman and the National Civil Rights Museum. In the 25 years of its existence, the National Civil Rights Museum has established itself as truly one of the world's premier museums. We're proud to have such an outstanding institution as our neighbor, and we're especially proud to have the museum as a partner in this historic event. And as I'd just like to say personally, it's been a tremendous pleasure to work with the museum and with Terry Freeman, and we look forward to continuing to work with the museum and Terry in the years ahead to continue the conversations that we'll be having at this symposium. Thanks to all of you for being with us today. We're very grateful for your time, and we promise it will be time very well spent. So welcome.
Thank you, Peter. So this past year of MLK 50 events would not have been possible without a community and the support from many individuals, corporations, and foundations. And this symposium is no different. Our list of sponsors can be found on page 15 of your program. They include Walmart, Sam's Club, the Hyde Family Foundation, FedEx, First Tennessee Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, BNSF, and AARP. Now, there was a time when if you weren't in this room, right here in one of these seats, you simply miss out on this rich programming. But today we have the beauty of technology to help many more than are present actually participate. I'd like to introduce our media and technology sponsor, Ms. Ebony Ruffins, Vice President of Local Media Development with Comcast Corporation. Ebony.
Thank you so much, Terry. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here on day 2 with all of you. One of the privileges of being a media and technology company like Comcast NBC Universal is a sincere motto that we take to heart, and it is this: a broadcast license is a public trust. A trust and an expectation that the media we carry, the programs we air, represent the broad and diverse audiences of the customers and communities we serve. And when seminal moments happen in American history, rarely have those moments occurred without the presence of and reliance on media to bear witness and then to engage and inform the public. At Comcast NBC Universal, we have the great privilege of providing access to content through Xfinity, our Xfinity Technology Services, and also producing content through news, film, and entertainment via our NBC Universal subsidiaries. We are so proud of our strong cross-company, that's Comcast, NBC Universal, partnership with the National Civil Rights Museum. Our deep ties with the museum began 4 years ago when we partnered with the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, and with the National Civil Rights Museum's founder, the late Judge D'Army Bailey. right here in Memphis. And we partnered with both institutions to expand Comcast NBC Universal's award-winning Voices of the Civil Rights Movement platform. Today, that platform features firsthand video interviews with more than 150 civil rights leaders, some of whom are here or here yesterday, and you'll hear from today, well-known and in some cases less known, and many of whom joined Dr. King in championing racial, education, and socioeconomic equality, all of whom gave a great and deliberate sacrifice for civil liberties we share, and most importantly, must safeguard today, now more than ever. Voices of the Civil Rights Movement is among the largest and farthest reaching civil rights initiatives of its kind, having reached more than 37 million social media users. The content is available at the National Civil Rights Museum, so for those who haven't been over there yet, go to the second floor. It's right outside of Hooks Hyde Hall. If you're an Xfinity customer, you can access it anytime through our amazing Black Film and TV folder. And even if you're not a customer, the general public can view and engage with the content for free at civrightsvoices.com. For this week's commemorative events, to honor and propel the call of civil rights issues to the broadest possible audience, Comcast NBC Universal is truly honored to bring the very best of our media and technology to the fore. We're providing free broadband services to the museum and to the media lounge. We have a supersized Wi-Fi on wheels truck where anyone, anywhere, Comcast customer or non-customer, can access free Wi-Fi if you're on the museum's campus without any charges. Again, I'll say that again. Comcast customer or non-customer, if you're on the museum's campus, you can access the Wi-Fi for free. We're also hosting a private screening at 5 p.m. tonight at the museum of our recent NBC and MSNBC documentary entitled Hope and Fury, MLK, the Movement and the Media. And this film examines how Dr. King and his contemporaries used the power of print and visual media, especially television, to awaken America to the shame and injustice of racial inequality. And among the documentary's featured civil rights historians is none other than today's keynote speaker, Taylor Branch. Tomorrow, to ensure that the MLK 50 events reverberate far beyond the city of Memphis, we're providing a free digital live stream so that anyone, anywhere in the world can see and share in the MLK 50 program. That's from 9:30 a.m. Central Time through the end of the bell toll tomorrow evening. So if your family and friends and colleagues, and I've spoken with many of you yesterday and today, who said, gosh, if so many people who wanted to be here but weren't physically able to be here, we understand, and we've got a front row seat waiting for them. They will be able to stream the content for free at the following two websites, and I'll repeat them both. civrightsvoices.com, again, that's civrightsvoices.com, or mlk50.civilrightsmuseum.org. That's mlk50.civilrightsmuseum.org. So again, thank you so much to President Freeman. It truly is Comcast NBC Universal's deep privilege and honor to commemorate and continue Dr. King's legacy of inclusion for our employees, our customers, and most especially for vital community partners like the National Civil Rights Museum. Have a wonderful day today. I look forward to seeing you all over the next 2 days. Thank you.
So bear with me, folks. I'm having a little bit of a allergy thing here in Memphis. That's a big deal. So I apologize. Now, I would like to introduce our presenting sponsor, Walmart Sam's Club. Tracy D. Brown is Senior Vice President of Operations and Chief Experience Officer. That sounds like a great title, a great job for Sam's Club. As our presenting sponsor for this day of the symposium, please join me in welcoming Ms. Brown, who will introduce you to our moderator, Ms. Michelle Norris, whose voice I'm sure you all know. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Terry. I'd like to speak for all of us at the Walmart Sam's Club family in congratulating you and your team and the National Civil Rights Museum on the great work, the creative work that is actually being done to keep the spirit of the civil rights movement alive and continuing to fight for the dream. As I reflect on the life of one of the greatest leaders in our history, I am reminded that exactly 50 years ago today, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived here in Memphis and checked into the room 306 at the Lorraine Motel on what would be the last full day of his life at age 39. We all know that on April 4th at 6:01 p.m., this country was forever changed. It is sobering to reflect on the life and the legacy of the great Dr. King, what he stood for, equality and justice, what he fought for, what he dreamed of, and to realize that today, in the 21st century, we are still fighting for the same things. Terry said something last night that stuck with me. She said the focus of today and this week's events is not about the assassination, but rather the legacy and what is yet to be accomplished. She said we must get busy about the work. And so the question, where do we go from here? To help answer that question and to honor Dr. King's memory, I'm excited to announce that the Walmart Foundation is making 12 grants today to nonprofit organizations across the country. We are getting busy about the work. Some of them have been working for positive change for generations, and some of these organizations that we're giving grants to are relatively new startups of social and economic justice. A vision Walmart has been proud to support in the past, and we're certainly looking forward to supporting in the future. These grants are focused on two areas of concern. One is strengthening community cohesion. The second is expanding pathways to career opportunity. One of these organizations is the Women's Foundation of Greater Memphis. They're launching a national collaborative to advance equity and outcomes for young women of color. And I'm delighted that the Women's Foundation CEO, Ruby Bright, and Vice President Shantae Avant are both here this morning. Now, I don't have time to salute all. The National Urban League, we're supporting the Project Lead, their ambitious effort to expand training opportunities for professional staff and local leaders. The second, the Coalition for Queens in New York City, for giving disadvantaged adults a new shot at good careers through training and in coding and other professional skills. And then finally, the Local Initiative Support Corporation for their support of community cohesion efforts involving underserved, diverse communities and local law enforcement. So there are many more committed and resourceful people and organizations like these that are all working to help realize Dr. King's still unmet hopes and dreams for America. Their presence and what they're doing is a major encouragement. So where do we go from here? Let's get busy. Let's get busy together and make some things happen. It's time to work. Thank you all very much. And now I have the great pleasure of introducing a woman who is well equipped to take us deeper in answering the question, where do we go from here? As the moderator of today's program, the distinguished national public radio journalist and author, Michelle Norris. Please help me welcome her to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to ask the panelists to join me for the first panel. Why don't you all come up and we can do introductions as we move into the living room. I am so deeply honored to be a part of this conversation today. Because as Terry told us, this is about looking at the legacy and figuring out how we celebrate Dr. King's life, how we figure out how we order our own steps so that we can realize the dream. But when we talk about Dr. King, we often talk about the dream, but he was a doer. He wasn't someone who just dreamed. And in some ways, we have done a little bit of a disservice to his memory by focusing so much on the dream as opposed to the work that he actually did. So we have a wonderful panel to discuss the legacy and where we find ourselves 50 years later. We have panels throughout the day, but I think we're going to begin by taking stock and taking measure of where we are. As a country in 1968, we faced significant economic headwinds. I don't know how many of you have read the book from which the seminar takes its title. Where do we go from here, from chaos to community? I've been carrying this around with me since January of this year. I'm sorry if this seems like a bit of an infomercial, but it is important that we share this because this book was written in 1967, 68, and it feels like it could have been written exactly for this moment.
Good morning, everyone. And where are we? So over the past 50 years, I went a little bit further, actually, and it's not moving. Okay, great. So where are we? We're still trapped by poverty, and it traps people surely as metal chains. And this thing is, okay, great. So this is the most important. Poverty has fallen. So there has been some progress made. However, can you advance it? This doesn't seem to be working. As you can see, we are still under tremendous poverty, and African American poverty is absolutely horrid. It is in Shelby County 3 times that of whites. So that should give us pause. Child poverty today is actually worse than in 1980. Notice that some of those numbers do not exist, and it is because we didn't even have a poverty measure before 1963, 64, when Molly Orshansky actually worked it out on the back of a napkin. So we start having poverty measures in the 70s, and then start having more. So you can see what's happened to poverty through the 90s. There was a decline, but it's starting to go up. And the other thing that is important to notice, if you notice the graph, black and white poverty are diverging in opposite directions. It is unconscionable that our rate of poverty is now higher for children than it was in 1980. Things are actually worse. And you can see it here. And again, you see that diverging graph where you see African American poverty and African American child poverty going higher, and white child poverty going lower. So that should give us pause. Here it is, what happens with total percent of families. Black families, 24.3% under poverty. White families, 5.5%. And so, again, the disparities are there, they're apparent, they have continued through the decades, and this is just terrible. There is another measure. There was no way to measure poverty before 1963. It does not get reported before the 1970 census. So what I did, I looked at 50% of the median, the number of households, the percent of households with wages or income that was at 50% the median or below. And as you can see, that by that measure, we're all doing worse. Whites, blacks, everybody. But of course, African American poverty is much worse. This is important. Everybody is doing worse in general. However, there are good news. The good news are in education. I was very, very pleased to see the gains in education and the high school completion in college attainment. That was very impressive. Can we have the next one? And you can see it here. You can see that African Americans have made tremendous gains in high school completion and have also made tremendous gains in college attainment. And percentage-wise, college attainment, that's 15%, 1,500% increase. 1,500% increase. That is tremendous. And I think we need to be proud. The African American community needs to feel proud about the strides and the gains they have made in education. And you can see it here, how 1950, it's very low. As we go through the decades, it rises and rises and rises. And so Brown versus Board of Education was very important, probably one of the most important, most significant pieces of legislation we could have ever had in this country. The college attainment is tremendous, 1,500%. We have the next. So here you have it, poverty and education. Now, here, when you see that high school and poverty are related immediately, you can see how greater number of students completing high school does reduce poverty immediately, right away. What do we do to go to the next level? That is what we need to do. Can we have the next one, please? So this one is another one. White-collar jobs. African Americans have also made tremendous gains in attaining white-collar jobs. And that is the result, of course, of a lot more education, high school completion, and college attainment. You can see that. However, they're not getting into the managerial positions at the same rate as whites. It has increased for everyone. There are a lot more people in those jobs, but for African Americans, there is still a lag. This is the key point of the entire report. No matter what, the wages for African Americans have remained stubbornly at around 50% of the wages of whites throughout the decades, no matter what else is going on. So can we have the next one? And this is for Shelby County, of course. So can we have the next one? And here you can see it. So what I did, I converted the numbers, in actual money numbers, to 2016 dollars, utilizing the Department of Labor Consumer Price Index calculator. And you can see that for African Americans, wages have actually remained kind of at the same level throughout the decades. That is somewhat true, not to the same degree for whites. It's also important to notice that the 90s were not as bad. In fact, things were improving through the 90s, and then we're back to getting worse. We have the next one. So here it is, median income, and you can see the disparities, very, very clear. The red line black median income. The green light is white median income. Now, the census did not even report white income or white poverty or white anything for 1980 because whites were considered to be the default. So they took out the people that were not considered people. I found this quite shocking. Can I have the next one? Can we have the next one? So here it is, that comparison. 1980, 2016. Not progress. Not progress. Looks almost identical. In fact, in this area, in education, yes, but in wages, same proportion. So that's a problem. We have the next one. The next slide, please. And then there's other ways in which African Americans are oppressed. And if you've read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, you'll understand the whole process by which the war on drugs and incarceration of African American, particularly African American males, has affected this population tremendously. Can we have the next one? So here is the institutionalized population, people that are in prison or in institutions. 1980, white and black. This is Shelby County, very similar. Now you can see the disproportionality. The African Americans are being imprisoned much worse rates than in 1980. And we know what got launched in 1980, and then in the 1980s. Can we have the next one? This is a national graph, and this is just to contextualize what's happening here. And so you can see that Memphis is not unique, and Shelby County is not unique. This is something that is happening throughout the nation, which is possibly the result of federal policies, although Shelby County has its own particular policies that are very punitive to African Americans. Can we have the next one? And so, is it a surprise that many African Americans perhaps are not able to enter the labor market? No, and this is one of the things that has happened. Males not in the labor market has increased tremendously. And so we really have to think about the policies that we're implementing. Can I have? No. So that's a report. It's encouraging in education. I think African Americans have taken advantage of every opportunity afforded to them when it comes to education, and I trust they will continue making gains in education. But what is the response of society to all of the effort that African Americans have made? Thank you.
Please. Why don't you come and join us, please? So thank you for that important benchmark to help us understand exactly where we are. I'd like to introduce the panel so you know who we're hearing from. That was Elena Delavega. She's an assistant professor of social work here at the University of Memphis. Next to her is Charles McKinney. He's the Neville Frierson Chair of Africana Studies and Associate Professor of History at Rhodes College. Thank you very much for being with us. Directly to my left is Michael K. Honey. He's the Fred T. and Dorothy G. Haley Endowed Professor of the Humanities at the University of Washington in Tacoma, as we in Washington, D.C. say, the other Washington. And to my right is Wendi Thomas. She is editor and publisher of MLK 50, Justice Through Journalism. I hope you have all been following her important work. I hear you got a woot woot out in the audience. And James H. Johnson, Jr. is the William K. Kenan, Jr. Distinguished Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship and Director of the Urban Investment Strategy Center at the Frank Hawkins Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. I'm going to start with you, James, and I want you quickly to just tell us where you think we are right now. What is the most, we heard about benchmarks in terms of incarceration, in terms of education achievement, in terms of opportunities in the workforce. But what is the most important, in your mind, measure that we should be looking at in terms of understanding where we are 50 years hence since Dr. King left this earth?
Clearly, I think it is about the state of our children. I think our kids are victimized by what I call the triple whammy of geographic disadvantage. Mm-hmm. I think our kids are characterized by concentrated poverty, hyper-segregation. I think we find them in communities that are what I call economically marginalized communities where there is little either financial or political support for their education. These triple whammy communities also are victimized by food deserts and food insecurity. They're also, our kids are victimized today by discriminatory disciplinary policies in education. 3 million kids suspended from school on an annual basis, and 250,000 of them referred to the police for misdemeanor charges as early as the 1st grade. Mm-hmm. And they tend to be black and brown. And you see the manifestations of that in higher education, where the sex ratio has been 60% female, 40% male for a decade.
So we're going to return to talk about some of these triple whammy communities. It's interesting, Dr. King once said that you can measure a country by the way it treats its children. Mm-hmm. Wendi, the most important benchmark for you?
I think the most important benchmark for me would be around jobs and wages. I mean, King came here to support underpaid public employees, and today, you know, Dr. Delavega's research showing that the median income, the racial gap there has not shrunk since they've started measuring it. And so I think we really have to look at how much employers are paying their workers. Their record profits, but that's not trickling down to the people who are actually creating the profits, who are doing the work.
And so when we chew on this a little bit, we're going to get into the work that you're doing around the living wage and understanding what that means for people. Michael, the most important benchmark for you?
Well, I'd like to second what Wendi said in her wonderful article in the New York Times last weekend. When Dr. King came to Memphis, he was pursuing the Poor People's Campaign, which was about housing, health care, jobs, meaningful income for all people, including all the poor people in America. But when he came to Memphis, he was confronted with the strike of the working poor, people who had jobs. And he was a labor union supporter all his life. He'd worked with unions since the Montgomery bus boycott. And it's no accident that he gave his life in a strike. He didn't do it intentionally, of course, but he put himself on picket lines for unions in New York City, Hospital Workers Union, and other places. He knew all the labor people. And he said the best antidote for somebody who has a job is a union. Mm-hmm. The best anti-poverty mechanism is a union. If you don't have a union, how are you going to push your wages up? Employers aren't going to do that for you. Government's not going to do that for you. You have to do that for yourself. But you have to be organized to do it. And that's what the Memphis story in '68 was all about. We have lost so many unions since then. We've lost International Harvester, Firestone, and rafts of industrialized places. That used to be the entree point into the black middle class for unionized workers.
So the benchmark for you is not just wages, but working conditions and
unions.
The state of unions in particular.
Organization. Mm-hmm. As we're talking, about 2,000 people are meeting over at Mason Temple. Mm-hmm. They're union workers from all over the country. This is what they want.
Charles, the most important benchmark for you?
The way we invest in segregation.
I want you to say that again, because
the way we invest in segregation.
And not in integration, but in segregation.
In segregation, mm-hmm. Right? These systems are not accidental. Right. We need poor people. We don't want poor people to be educated. We don't want poor people to have access to decent wages. We attract people here because of that poverty. So we're not really, are we invested in actually fixing it, right? King, if we're going to be serious about King, if we're going to be serious about King, if we're going to be serious about what he said in that book, then we have to make a serious assessment of our investment in segregation. So we can't simultaneously be invested in a status quo that makes people poor, that makes people uneducated, and say we want to fix education and poverty. We can't have it both ways. So we have to take a cold hard assessment of our investment in segregation. That's the Kenan thing to do, and that's hard to do.
And we're going to return to that also, because you're talking about not just economic investment, but emotional and psychological investment, the comfort that
yes.
that people take in this
right.
status.
That has emotional and psychological investment that ultimately has political impact, that has educational impact, that has economic impact.
Elena, now you went through several measures, several benchmarks, but of those, which is the most important for us, for you to? Which is the most important you think that we should focus on?
I think that the wages are very, very important, and also the attainment of managerial positions, because that's access. But ultimately, I think that what everybody has said on the panel is an important piece. And I don't think we can work on one piece. I think we have to work on a lot of the pieces. I think we do need to start on wages. Wages are very important, but we need to do it in an inclusive way that does not segregate. And we have to do it together. And the way to do it together is through unions. And we have to make investments in our communities that are investments to get people to move out of poverty, not investments to exclude and segregate people. So I think that all of this is the same thing. We're talking about the same thing. We can look at the indications of wages, and we can look at the indicators of disparities. We're all talking about the same thing, and there is exclusion, and it's exclusion by race, and there are people who simply do not have access to participation in society.
Let's begin with wages. Let's begin with wages. Wendi, you've been doing some important work in a survey about the living wage in Memphis. Tell us a little bit about the survey and the work that you've been doing at MLK Memphis 50 and what you discovered, and also the impediments. I understand that it was difficult to actually pull together some of this data because not everybody wanted to provide you with the information. You needed to actually be able to do the broadest possible survey.
Right, right. So MLK 50, Justice Through Journalism, which you can find at mlk50.com, did a living wage survey of the area's largest 25 employers, and collectively they employ about 160,000 workers. And so we wanted to know, do you pay your workers at least $15 an hour? Do you offer health insurance to full and part-time employees? Do you outsource workers? Do you use temporary workers? And you're right, a lot of companies just wouldn't respond, ignored multiple requests. I'm going to try to be polite and not point them out, or maybe I will. The University of Memphis was one that didn't respond to the survey. And so I think that while it's great to host events, I think it's also good to have a conversation internally about whether you pay your workers enough to live on. And so there were some organizations that do pay all of their workers a living wage. International Paper is one. Surprisingly, or maybe not, city and county government actually were not that bad. They do pay some workers less than $15 an hour, but it's a much smaller percentage, 15, 12% than you would think. Shelby County Schools just a couple weeks ago announced that they're going to raise the pay of all their workers, the lowest ones, to at least $15 an hour. And so, teachers are unionized, getting back to the union things. You've got unions in the public sector employees, and so we are making a mockery of King's legacy if we don't really wrestle with these things. And everybody starts out where they are, right? If you're not paying your workers enough today, okay, that's just the reality today, but what is your plan to truly embody King's legacy and raise those wages to something that workers can live on?
So every so often we're going to stop and just sort of dig into the glossary of the terms that we use, because when we toss around the term living wage, not everybody understands exactly what that means. And that was something that in 1968 we were beginning to discuss exactly what that meant. People perhaps hear about minimum wage,
Right.
But that's very different than living wage. So could you help us understand the difference between minimum wage and living wage? When you're talking about a living wage, what exactly were you trying to define and capture in your survey?
Right. So minimum wage in Tennessee is $7.25 an hour. Tennessee actually doesn't have a state minimum wage, so it defaults to the federal. There are 5 states that don't have their own minimum wage, and they're all former slaveholding states. And that's not a mistake. That's not an accident, I don't think. So a living wage, according to the MIT living wage calculator in the Memphis metro area, is $10.75 for a single adult with no children. And that rises to about over $20 an hour for a single adult with 1 child, and it just progressively goes up. The Fight for 15 benchmark that they've set of $15 an hour is the difference between the $7.25 federal minimum wage and $22 an hour, which is what minimum wage would be if it kept pace with productivity, not inflation, but productivity. And so that's why the $15 an hour mark was the one that our project used.
And that's based on, and John, I want to go to you now, and I want you to take that information that you just heard and then overlay that with the average, what the average household actually looks like. When we're talking about living wage, how does that actually align with the way people are living? A lot of these metrics are based on a traditional household, right? Where 2-parent household, 2.3 children, that is not what we actually see in a lot of these homes where we're actually trying to apply these statistics.
That's absolutely right. Our population has changed dramatically since 1960, and households and living arrangements have changed tremendously. In the African-American community and communities of color, we're far more likely to be multi-generational households. We're far more likely today to have a large number of households that are, the head of the household is a senior adult with adult children and grandchildren that are disconnected from the labor market, which means that there are 3 generations where there have been no upward mobility in those households and the like. And so when we start talking about economic well-being, we need to be mindful of how our households and living arrangements have changed. And, you know, the war on drugs and incarceration didn't help that, because we've incarcerated a lot of people and now we're releasing them back into the communities where they don't have access to employment and jobs, and so they end up back home with mothers and grandmothers and the like. And it's the vulnerable households are, most vulnerable are older adults with adult children and grandchildren in the household living on about $17,000 worth of Social Security income. We got to figure out, and it's incredibly important in this community because the most rapidly growing population is the 65-plus population, increased by 25% since 2010, when the community is growing by about 1.5% totally. I mean, this whole thing about aging needs to be factored into this conversation, because that is one of the big drivers, and it manifests itself in the African American community in a major way.
We're going to come back to that, but I want to talk about one of the other members in the household,
Sure.
the young man who was incarcerated.
Yeah.
Michael, did Dr. King anticipate in any way the impact that incarceration rates would have on the economic well-being of the community he cared most about, but also on the economic well-being of the country as a whole?
I don't think in 1968 mass incarceration was on his mind. What was on his mind was what he saw in Mississippi when he came through Memphis on March 18th and then went down into the Mississippi Delta. People had been cast off by the plantation economy. He saw masses of unemployed poor people, Indian reservations, poor whites in Appalachia, African Americans in all these industries that had been closed down. And then he saw the rising public sector employment. And so he saw that as an entryway into higher wages for everybody. I just was on a program with Reverend James Lawson. He describes it as plantation capitalism. It's the idea that was so prevalent in the South, and it goes back to slavery, which King talked about all the time. I just published a book called To the Promised Land. And in that book, I take you back to his great-grandparents who were slaves and his grandparents who were sharecroppers. And so the way Reverend Lawson sees it is the way King saw it, that these are the deficits created over generations of slavery and segregation, which would include incarceration, convict labor, all of those things that were present. And the difference between him and what we're talking about today is some people still have the idea in Memphis and many other places that low wages is how you make profits, and low wages is good for investing companies. And that's how Memphis was built in many ways in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Low wages, which means particularly black workers who don't have advantages and so forth. So he wanted to break that cycle, and he wanted people to see that bringing people up is good for your economy. It's not, low wages is bad for your economy. But how do you do it? The workers themselves have to do it. Poor people themselves have to get organized. That's what the Poor People's Campaign was. So the Fight for 15, people gathered from all over the South on February 12th, the 50-year anniversary of the strike, and they picketed McDonald's, and they went out to the low-wage places and put pressure on them, and they conferenced about how do we spread out from Memphis, and what they're using is what I call the bonds of memory. King's last speech, To the Promised Land, which is the title of this book that's coming out today. What was the Promised Land? He saw the Promised Land as a place where everybody had not just a minimum wage, everybody had a living wage, a decent income. And if you can't provide it through jobs, you provide it some other way. And that's what investment is all about. So it's all of those things that we have to deal with. We have a government in power with the president who said wages are too high. Trump said that during his campaign. Wages are too high. And they want to break public employee unions. They have a case before the U.S. Supreme Court that would break public employee unions coming up very soon. His idea is low wages. That's what he pays people at Mar-a-Lago. So we have people in power now who want to take us back to the late 19th century where workers had no power, had no rights. It would be disastrous for our economic situation in Memphis and other communities.
So if you set aside the current administration, I know that's difficult to do, but if you set that aside and just look at the dream that he envisioned and the blueprint that he was working on when he was writing so furiously in the last few years of his life, how do you then adjust that with the things that we've seen in the last 10 years, with really in the last 20 years, with incarceration rates being what they are, and now with automation, with the downward pressure on wages because of technology, and the fact that so many people are in jobs that could easily be replaced by a robot, by a system, by some machine that is controlled by someone, who puts in a chip.
He did talk about that a lot. He went to the United Auto Workers Union where this was happening at the time, automation, so-called cybernation. He saw that, and all the union people saw that coming, and that this would dispossess a lot of people of jobs. He said, but there's so much work that needs to be done. We need to build the infrastructure, the bridges, and the schools, and the human services. And he said, it's a crime to live in a rich country and receive starvation wages. People can do these jobs, but it requires public investment and private investment as well. And then for the people who are cast off, who maybe don't have the skills, as in Mississippi when he visited down there, he said, if this country cannot provide wages at a living income, it has to provide income. One way or another, people have to be made into consumers, because people can choose their own way. They can go to college, they can do things if they have that income. The difference is if you don't have that income. And so that would apply now, and mass incarceration is a way of dealing with cast-off people who don't have jobs, who don't have income, who are easily scooped up by the police in low-income communities. It's really a lot about economics and race, of course.
And can I just add really quickly onto that point? I just saw something a little while ago. In California now, it costs more a year to incarcerate an individual than it does to attend Harvard University.
Yes.
Right? And so this is also the consequence. So this is also the consequence of mass incarceration that is highly and virulently racialized, right? If the face of the incarcerated is a black face, right, a black male face, and increasingly a black female face, right, rates of incarceration for black women, also really troubling, really problematic. You know, we've got a national mindset that says yes, right? $80,000 a year to lock somebody up, yes, let's do it, let's do it. So that gets back to, again, this shifting of the paradigm in terms of, right, and this is also back to segregation and slavery, right, the containment of black bodies, right, and so even in instances where it literally doesn't make any fiscal sense, right, to engage in the patterns and practices that we engage in, we still see a deep, deep investment, right? So fiscal conservatives who are all about pinching pennies and stuff, you hit them with this, you know, hit them with the, you know, hey, it costs $80,000 a year to lock a person up, and it costs $40,000 a year to educate them. Which one would you prefer? Well, who is it, right? Oh, him, we can lock up, right? So again, that investment in, you know, the racialized nature of mass incarceration is killing us economically, right? It's killing us socially. It's killing us in so many different ways. But that investment is so deep, and that's why I was saying earlier we got to shift this paradigm.
When you talk about the emotional, psychological investment, how do you start to unpack that? Because that's not something you can legislate. That's not something that you can do by fiat.
Yeah,
stroke of a pen.
Right. I mean, it's deeply connected to, right? I'm a student of segregation and civil rights, right? So the trauma related to segregation is a function of segregation, right? So one of the most effective ways to deal with the trauma of dislocation and subordination is to deal with the things that cause those things, right? So, for instance, what does that mean? And let me give you a quick example. This, again, gets back to shifting paradigms, right? So it's 1940, and white children and black children start school at 8 o'clock, right? Now, the white children get on a bus, right? The school's 4 or 5 miles away. The black children don't have a bus, which means the black children have to walk to school, right? Many of our parents, if you're from the South, you're familiar with this paradigm, right? So sometimes the black children are late. What's the response in the classroom? You need to be more responsible. How come you're so sloppily dressed? Why are you so sweaty? Well, I'm so sweaty because I just walked 4 miles, right? So the assault that's launched on the children that leads to trauma is a function of the context of segregation, right? So if we want to reduce trauma, we have to reduce the structures that lead to the trauma, right? 2018, talking to people about, well, you know, employees need to be more responsible when it comes to getting to work on time. Now, we understand here in Memphis that, you know, the transportation system here is deplorable, right? It takes 2.5 hours to get from one end of Poplar Avenue, right? You know, the Poplar corridor here in town, you know, if you need to go from one end of Poplar to another, that's a 20-minute ride. But if you need to go anywhere north and south, i.e. where the black people live, that's another hour on your trip. Right? So the reason I'm late to work is because I got to be at work at 8 o'clock and I got 2 kids. What am I doing with my kids? I got to get on a bus at 6 o'clock to be at work at 8 o'clock. You need to be more responsible. Well, maybe I need to be more responsible, but maybe we need to shift the segregation era transportation system so that I can, in fact, get to work on time. Right? So again, the trauma that so many people are experiencing is a result of, right, the segregated contexts in which they have to navigate. I have to talk to my boys. My wife and I have two boys. And so I'm going to spend the totality of their time in public schools navigating the trauma that is foisted upon them because, well, I was talking loud in the class. I was talking loud in the hallway in between classes, and I got sent to the principal's office, right? So I got to navigate that trauma. And the way I have to navigate it is I have to deal with my sons and tell them, look, you know what? This is what it is, right? In terms of navigating these spaces and navigating these flexible ideas related to behavior and all these other things. But I also tell them that, yeah, you know what? There's a double standard going on here, right? Because little Billy and little Susie were allowed in the classrooms, were allowed in the hallways in between classes, and mysteriously they didn't wind up in the principal's office, right? So that's the other thing we have to do, right? And so again, the trauma that people are feeling is definitely and intimately connected to the realities in which they are navigating. And so we have to deal with those realities so that then we can then substantively deal with the trauma. Because if we don't deal with the external realities, that's the definition of insanity, right? You know, I'm traumatized by my circumstances. You are traumatized, right? That's not a pattern for success.
So I'm going to ask once again that we stop and have a glossary session, because you're using the word trauma. And for a lot of people, traumatic is something, it is a word that is used to describe horror of a certain kind, but it is a scientific term. There's a body of research that shows that some of the things that you are describing actually have deleterious effects. They actually impact someone's well-being, their physical well-being. Yes. Actually impacts their health. If we can talk just for a minute about that.
There was an amazing panel yesterday of sisters talking about poverty in American life, and talking about trauma that is inhabited in black bodies, right? And one of the statistics that haunts me was that regardless of socioeconomic status, right, black women are more likely to die in childbirth than white women, right? Regardless of income, right? So whether you're working class or whether you're Serena Williams, right?
Who wrote about her experience?
Right, and so
to raise her hand
and so researchers are now saying, well, what's the correlation here? What is this thing that is leading to these inordinate amounts of black female deaths? And the answer to that question is racism. Right? The answer to that question is having to day in, day out battle the reality of white supremacy. It is literally killing us. That's the trauma, right? That's the trauma. So, you know, and I think you're right. We have to be careful about the way in which words are sort of bandied about in terms of, you know, and how we use the words, right? But I think this word applies to these particular, you know, to this particular context in most definitely, right? And so we can think about the trauma that black women are experiencing, right? And how that trauma manifests itself in these ways. We can think about trauma in the way it manifests itself in higher rates of hypertension, higher rates of high blood pressure, bleaker health disparities, you know, bleaker health outcomes based on zip code, right? You know, there's some other statistics that you've got zip codes that have got a 30-year life expectancy differential, right? 30 years, right? From zip code to zip code, right? And so that's about life choices, but that's also about having to navigate the realities of living in a society that has been weaponized, right? When it comes to black bodies, when it comes to black life, right? And so I think, you know, again, dealing with the trauma, we've got to figure out, and we have to be honest and assess, right, the ways in which our commitment to segregation leads directly to these traumas, right? Brown v. Board. Why do black kids prefer the white dolls to the black dolls, right? You know, Kenneth Clark and Kenneth and Mamie
a study
Clark,
that was repeated and fairly recently, and showed that students
right. You know, that's trauma. Right, that the image of yourself, right, you determine is ugly and stupid. Right? Think about how deep that trauma is. Malcolm X, I'll say this and I'll shut up. Malcolm X, in Autobiography of Malcolm X, mentions one teacher. The teacher one of his favorite teachers in elementary school. And he said, and he was doing great in this class. And he said went up to his teacher, it was a white teacher, this is Nebraska, right? Went up teacher, told the teacher, I want to be a lawyer when I grow up. Teacher told him, no, Malcolm, niggers can't be lawyers. You're good with your hands. You should be a carpenter. That's the one teacher that shows up in the Autobiography of Malcolm X. That Malcolm remembered that moment. And so in the year before he died, talking to Alex Haley, right? He's like, that's the one teacher that I remember. That is trauma, right? That is trauma. That regardless of your expectations, regardless of what you're actually doing in this classroom, my expectations are so low of you that I am shocked and appalled that you would say something like that. That's trauma. When we tell people that you should work for 40 or 50 hours a week and make wages where you can't feed yourself or your family, that's trauma, right? So, you know, again, it's tied to the material reality, it's tied to the material conditions.
James, what he's discussing, the trauma, there is a graphic that appeared online, in the New York Times online edition, that if you saw it, you will never forget it. And I think you probably know what I'm talking about, this sort of disaggregation of experience for black males. Black males, no matter what station of life they are born into, have a much greater probability of downward mobility throughout their life. So even if they are born into relative affluence, if they're born into a home with a high level of education and income, at some point in their life they will face this sort of cement shoe phenomenon. Could you help explain why we see that?
Well, the research says it's all about social capital, and we talk a lot about mentoring, but I think it's more important to talk about sponsorship. The ones who make it are sponsored. It's not that they're necessarily the most talented, but it's having the hookup and the connections that lead to upward mobility once you get at certain points in. And this is about, Mark Granovetter wrote a book back in the 70s that says it's not just strong ties that matter, but rather it's the strength of your weak ties. This is about having weak ties. Weak ties are with people that you don't hang out with on a daily basis. They're usually more diverse and different from you. And those are the people who I can mentor you and give you advice, but they can pick up the phone and hook you up. Mm-hmm. And that's the difference, and it's a very, very important difference. What we have to do in our community is make sure that we build diverse networks for our kids outside of their neighborhoods, what Harvard political scientist Bob Putnam calls bridging social capital. Mm-hmm. The more diverse your networks are, the more geographically expansive they are, the better off you're going to be in life. That's how we have to overcome segregation. When you're in a segregated environment, you have what is called bonding social capital. Most of the people you hang out with are just like you. I did a study back in the 90s looking at professional black women on this note, mm-hmm. and I looked at their networks. And I asked, and these are all educated black women. The black women who had at least one white male in their sphere of influence earned on average $17,000 more per year than comparably trained black women who had a racially homogeneous network. These networks matter. Spatial isolation, segregation constrains networks, but in a social media world, we ought to be able to connect kids with very, very diverse networks that are global, but we have to do it in a conscious kind of way and get people to understand the value of sponsorship mm-hmm. as opposed to just mentorship. Doesn't mean mentorship isn't important, but sponsorship is really important.
So add that to your glossary. There's mentorship and then there's sponsorship.
There's sponsorship.
And Wendi, break that down for us here in Memphis and what that means. And I want to add just another element to this conversation. Because if you look at social capital, the experience, when we talk about King's legacy at this moment, it is still somewhat of a binary discussion. Mm-hmm. We're still talking about black America and white America. America is much more diverse than that, obviously. Right. And when you look at immigrant experiences in sort of the second wave of immigrants, and when you look at the immigrant experience now with large numbers of South Asians, Latinos, the use of social capital in those communities has allowed, in many cases, them to move up the economic ladder much faster. Right. So if you could just talk a little bit about the Memphis experience in that regard.
Right. So, you know, I think thinking about how integrated or not integrated our social networks are is really interesting. I think often when non-people of color, white people, think about integration, it means there's one or two people of color in the room, whereas when people of color in Memphis do, they think about it in terms of Memphis is majority black. So if I walk into a space that's not majority black, it doesn't look like Memphis. That's not Memphis. And so if you were to walk into the C-suites, executive offices of many of the major companies here in Memphis, you're not going to find a lot of black faces. One of the stories one of my reporters wrote that's online today was using EEO1 data, Equal Opportunity Commission data, looking at the different classifications of workers. So they break it down by executive managers, middle managers, you know, kind of more secretarial work, laborers, what have you. And in the Memphis metro area, 88% of the executive senior managers are white. And again, Memphis as a city is 64% black. The county is 54% black. The metro area is 48% black. Yet white people are way overrepresented in these senior jobs. And if you look at the laborer class of jobs, those are comprised, 73% of laborers are black in Memphis. So way overrepresented based on our share of the population. And so clearly we still have a really long way to go. And as somebody who is, you know, when you're talking about sponsors, I can think of the people who got me my jobs, and they were all white men, you know, and so that is very important, having those networks, people who can say, yeah, hire her.
But when we have this discussion, is the at present majority culture included enough in this discussion? So Dr. King, and I was looking for it in the pages of the book, talks about how the key to forward progress is a double-sided lock. And the Negro community only has, and I'm using the language of the book here, only has access to one side of that lock. That white America has access to the other side of that lock. And yet when we talk about fixing these problems, finding solutions to these problems, the people who are at the heart of these problems are often the center of the conversation. I mean, look at the panel that we've assembled. There are people who are either, have studied this, but not necessarily people who are in the position to be a sponsor, to actually do the hiring, to actually decide whether or not to work with unions. How do you include the other side of this equation in the conversation?
There's one thing I'll say. Someone else said this smarter than me, that if you want to solve a problem, you need to study who profits from it, not who suffers from it. And so often we don't have the people who profit from it at the table in the room.
Yeah. I think that the important thing to say about sponsorship is that you don't choose your sponsor, your sponsor chooses you. And so the question becomes then, well, what do I need in my toolkit to maximize the likelihood that I get chosen to be sponsored? That means thinking about the new world of work and how dramatic the world of work today is from back in the late 60s and early 70s. We talk a lot about what you need in your toolkit to weather the new normal of certain uncertainty in our economy. And no one would doubt that you need the serious analytical skills that a STEM education gives you. But what I will tell you is if you look at black STEM graduates, their unemployment rate is 10%, when the unemployment rate for all STEM graduates is like about 5%. And so clearly you need something else in your toolkit. What are those other things? Well, you need entrepreneurial acumen in this economy. We talk a lot about employers and what they're looking for in this economy. I think we all are going to be free agents moving forward. So the question becomes is how do you brand yourself JimJohnson.com, because that's what you're going to be promoting in the marketplace. What do you need in your toolkit? You need the entrepreneurial acumen, because the only constant is change, and if one door shuts in your face, you're going to have to figure out how to cut another one in this economy. Secondly, you need contextual intelligence, the ability to read the tea leaves of change, particularly to ensure that you're not blindsided by unanticipated change, becoming a master of information management. This is contextual intelligence, impeccable soft skills, and cultural elasticity, the ability to move from the streets to the suites without missing a beat. That's what it's all about in the cultural context today.
What the kids would call code switching. What the kids would call code switching.
Yeah, right. That's exactly right. And then you need a lifelong learning mindset, because you have to have the agility and flexibility to constantly reinvent. I don't know what has happened since we've been on this stage, but it could be something that has happened geopolitically that's totally disruptive of our economy, and you may not have a job when you turn your phone on. I don't know, but it could be something like that.
So hold on. So if unions are important, how do you rely on your union to protect you in a totally disruptive economy? I mean, we now know, Astro Teller from Google tells us that most kindergartners will occupy jobs that do not yet exist.
You know, the way I kind of look at it is politically. So all these things that we're talking about are crucial things on a personal level, and trying to move forward in this kind of economy, and how do you do it? I think that one of the genius aspects of Dr. King was, one, is he brought the religious framework in about what is right and what is wrong. And anybody could understand it. So I was growing up as a kid who was not a Baptist, I was a Unitarian. I completely got what he was saying, and so I became a conscientious objector to war. So his framework was very, very religious and very political at the same time. And we're in a country now where lots and lots of people are looking at each other and saying, is this our country? Is this the way that things are supposed to go? We're in a moment of huge danger in our country. And in my book, To the Promised Land, I start out with his quote, which fits right now so well. And so I think we've got a big problem of not only all of us individually and in our communities moving forward, and how do we do it? We have to go even farther. We have to deal with the whole system out there, building alliances and organizations that cross all the barriers. And that King was a master at that, and his legacy is partly that, you know, that we can build multiracial movements for change, and that are radical, even revolutionary, based on nonviolence. And he said, whether it's the ultra-right wing in the form of the Birch Societies, or the alliance between military and big business, or the coalition of Southern Dixiecrats and Northern reactionaries, whatever the form, these menaces now threaten everything decent and fair in American life. And that's where we are 50 years later. We have a coalescence of the right-wing forces that believe in low wages, that believe in dropping people off, who, you know, just forget about those people, the throwaway people. We don't care. We have people who are all concerned about funneling the money upwards, not downwards. We have a president who, you know, has no sense of fair play or fairness or what's right and what's wrong. And the right wing has coalesced around this, and they're getting money from the business people to do it because it's to their advantage. So we're sort of in this crisis moment that Dr. King was talking about. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? I think it's all the things that we're talking about, and in addition, we need a movement. We have to build a movement that's multiracial, that's inclusive for all people, that deals with mass incarceration, unemployment, the working poor. It's a very political situation that we're in, and there's no way around it. You know, this is going to go on for some years now, and hopefully not for another term after this, but that could happen if we don't move, if we don't get involved now. So they're having the conference over there. I Am 2018 asked me as saying, remember the historical memory of King, remember the legacy, get moving, you know, build your alliances, build your coalitions, build your networks, vote these people out of office to begin with. And when you vote them out, have a program to put in that place. With all these young kids fighting the gun violence, I hope they are moving in that same direction. Okay, if we knock these people out of power, then what? What's our plan for change? And I think that there's a rich legacy that we have from the freedom movement, from the labor movement, from the women's movement, from the anti-war movement. These are things that a lot of us grew up with. And it's not rocket science, it's organizing. It's getting ourselves together. And it can be done. In Memphis in 1968 and 69, despite that tragedy, I came here in 1970, I met Reverend James Lawson and a lot of people. Despite the horrible things, Memphis was energized, and we put black people in power and women in power in the 70s. We started working on this range of issues. People did not give up. They did not despair because of this thing that happened here. And, you know, Memphis has changed dramatically. When I first came here, the Lorraine Motel was a broken down shack. Basically, it was all boarded up, and the city wanted to tear it down. They wanted to forget about it, wipe it out, pretend it never happened. Now you come to Memphis, and you see banners all around. Remember 2018, where do we go from here? you know, civic life has been transformed. So what is the problem? David Sissel, the economist, and I sort of surveyed this situation. We said the problem is that still we're living with poverty wages, and to change that, we have to change this superstructure and framework. And that's true everywhere in America.
Thank God they did not tear down that.
And they did not tear down the hotel.
Thank God. And thank God that we continue to look at the rearview mirror and we are informed by our past as we figure out our way forward. When Dr. King talked about chaos or community, he talked about leaning into chaos, leaning into something that looks cataclysmic, that looks like it portends bad things on the horizon. I want to leave us on, if not a positive note, a note that looks at perhaps something that we can draw from what looks to be a difficult situation, draw perhaps a measure of hope. And many of you were asked to think of a big idea, and James, or Jim, if I can call you Jim,
sure.
You actually had an interesting idea in looking at the demographics of our country, because right now our poverty rates are tied in part to our aging population,
yeah.
and a question about what to do with an aging population. And you note that that's something that there's a good deal of opportunity. Yes. If we look at this from a sort of a different policy framework. Sure. We only have a few minutes left, but if you could quickly leave us with this thought.
I've just written this piece on aging as an engine of innovation, business development, and job creation. This city is growing. The most rapidly growing population is the 65-plus population. Everything in the built environment has to change to accommodate an aging population. So all the infrastructure, whether it's public infrastructure, private infrastructure, whether it's the hospital, whether it's the public library, the post office, all has to change to accommodate an aging population. That's job creation. We need 1.25 million additional senior care workers between now and 2025. That's job creation. And the possibility for innovations to help older, vulnerable adults age in their homes and in their communities is just phenomenal. We think that there's a huge, huge upside here that can be an engine for and a driver of job growth and business development. And I think it's really worth looking at because, you know, the challenge for Memphis is it's not growing. And the people that you're losing are prime working age individuals. And so I say you have to develop your own through improving public education and bring back your own. The talented people who've gone away, it's a propitious opportunity to do it because many of those people who are doing well someplace else got aging parents and grandparents here. It's time to come home.
Jim, Wendi, Michael, Charles, Elena, thank you very, very much. Our first panel is concluded and we're going to move on to panel 2, but first we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. If you're wearing a watch that's telling you to stand up, this would be a good time to do that. Shake a leg, and then we'll be right back here in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Enjoyed that. Really good. Transcript of work.
Yes, thank you.
sir.